Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a truly fascinating hypothesis straight from our source material. We're looking at the idea, and it's a big one, that ancient Chinese characters, which are literally some of the oldest continuously used written symbols in the world, might actually contain pictographic evidence of the biblical Genesis narrative. We're going to neutrally examine this linguistic puzzle together, breaking down the characters stroke by stroke, just to see exactly what the authors of our source material have uncovered. It really brings us to this central, kind of detective-like question. Could a 4,000-year-old language hold the secrets of Genesis? Regardless of your personal theological background, the visual etymology we're about to decode is objectively captivating. We're going to look at how basic linguistic building blocks might parallel one of the most famous origin stories in human history. So let's keep an open mind and look strictly at the linguistic evidence presented. Section 1, Adam in the West, the first man alone. So, to set the scene exactly how our source material does, we begin with the biblical figure of Adam. According to the text, he's placed in the Garden of Eden, totally occupied with naming the animals, but there's this profound realization that he is entirely alone. This quote establishes our narrative anchor. Genesis 2:20 states, "The man gave names to all cattle, but for the man there was not found a helper fit for him. He has no mate to communicate with or share his existence." And our source notes that it was late in the afternoon of this eventful day, with the sun beginning to slip down into the western sky, a little detail that perfectly sets up our very first piece of linguistic evidence. Now, to really get this, we kind of have to understand how Chinese characters actually work. Basically, they're built from fundamental symbols called radicals. Notice the sequence here. We start with the radical for one, then we add the radical for man, and finally, we combine that with the radical for an enclosure or a garden. When you put one, man, and enclosure all together, the result is the standard Chinese character for West. According to the source, this pictograph literally illustrates the first man, alone, in a garden enclosure right as the sun sets in the west. Looking right at the actual calligraphy from our source to visually confirm this equation, you can clearly see the character for West, and right with it, that box-like radical for enclosure. The source material breaks this down to show how these primitive strokes combine so perfectly to form this specific meaning. It really grounds us right into the ancient script. Section 2, a necessary mate, West plus woman. Okay, so the first man is in the West, in his enclosure, and he realizes he urgently needs a companion. The solitude isn't just a state of being anymore, it's become a pressing need. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the language actually builds on itself to convey that complex idea. We take that exact character for West, the one representing the man alone in the enclosure, and we add the primitive radical for woman. When you combine West and woman, you don't just get a plural, you create an entirely brand new word in the Chinese language. Check out the resulting character. It means want, important, or necessary. Think about how brilliantly that mirrors the biblical account. For the man alone in the West, a woman wasn't just some casual addition. She was an absolute necessity. The very concept of wanting or needing something is literally memorialized by the image of the first man needing a woman. Moving on to Section 3, forming one flesh, the first surgery. So to solve this absolute necessity for a mate, the narrative describes what could arguably be called the very first surgery. We anchor our next visual breakdown with this specific biblical description from Genesis 2:21. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. It's a highly physical, descriptive moment, right? It involves entering the body, removing something, and then closing the flesh back up. And here's where the linguistic analysis gets just incredibly vivid. Our source analyzes the Chinese character for flesh. The author actually describes it as a moving picture of an operation. Notice the outer border radical, that shape that looks almost like an upside-down U. The text suggests this visually mimics a surgical incision, or maybe a flap that's been opened up and will be repositioned at the conclusion of the procedure. Let's move to the breakdown and see how this builds. Inside that surgical flap border, we have the radical, meaning to enter or go inside, which the source likens to a hand literally going inside the chest. Alongside it is another character for person, representing the woman being removed. So a border or flop, a hand entering, and a person coming out, all of this combines to mean flesh. It is a stunning visual parallel to the creation of Eve from Adam's flesh. And just to add another layer to this, the source points out a pretty fascinating linguistic quirk. Even today, a Chinese word sometimes used for wife literally translates to inside or inner. The source material points out that referring to a wife as the inside man ties very, very closely back to this concept of Eve being formed from the literal inside, the inner flesh of Adam. Section 4. The enclosed garden. Dust and breath. Okay, so the operation is complete, and Adam and Eve are united in their sanctuary. Now we're going to break down the highly complex character for garden into its primitive radicals. Think of this as the ultimate piece of our linguistic puzzle. It's built from several distinct concepts: dust, breath, two persons, and a large enclosure. The source argues that this directly depicts God creating living creatures from the dust with a word or breath from his mouth. Then he created the first two sinless persons, Adam and Eve, and finally, he placed them safely within the boundaries of Eden. Let's literally walk through the specific calligraphy here. It's like a giant puzzle. You can see the evolution and summarization of the creation story mapped out. Look at how the symbols for dust and breath combine. Then, right beside them, you see the clear strokes representing two persons. Finally, an outer box, the enclosure, wraps all the way around these elements, perfectly defining the boundaries of this ancient sanctuary. And this brilliantly illustrates how just a single character can encapsulate the entire Genesis creation narrative. Dust plus breath plus two persons, wrapped in an enclosure, equals garden. The source concludes that the only two perfect human beings ever to exist were Adam and Eve, having this specific garden as their home. I mean, it's an absolutely astonishing amount of narrative data packed into one single ideogram. Section 5. Hidden History, the 4,000-year question. So the crucial point is, when we step back and summarize what the source has laid out for us, we started with West, the first man alone in an enclosure. Then we saw Necessary, that man in the West urgently needing a woman. We looked at Flesh, picturing a person and an entering hand within a surgical flap. And finally, Garden, two people formed from dust and breath, placed safely in an enclosure. Step by step, the symbols mirror the story. Because as the source material powerfully puts it, these connections have been preserved for more than 4,000 years for our investigation and study. Regardless of your personal beliefs, these ancient pictographs represent a truly remarkable millennia-old intersection of linguistics and historical narrative. They were locked into the written Chinese language long, long before modern communication could ever link these ancient cultures together. Which really just leaves us with this final massive question. Are these highly specific linguistic overlaps mere coincidence, just a quirk of ancient artistry? Or do they represent a shared memorial of early human history, embedded deep within the bedrock of one of our oldest languages? It's an incredible mystery to ponder as you look at the written word. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history hidden right in front of our eyes.